That's maybe a nice segue into the topic of today's conversation, which would be the steps, really discussing the steps that Russia has been taking towards uh, pegging its currency to something more valuable than paper. And what's most interesting to me here, Bob, is that you already knew this. You knew that this was coming, right? Because when we spoke maybe 3 weeks ago or something, you told me that whatever happens in the short term, Russia will be trying to peg its currency to some physical commodity. And here we are now, after the Russian central bank put sort of like a floor under the gold price of that 5,000 rubles, and after Putin pegged their currency to oil as well, starting saying that they're not going to ship any oil unless it's for rubles. Now there's this third step that's undergoing right now, whereby the what do they call him? The secretary of the Russian Federation Security Council, Nikolai, whatever. He appears to have said that Russia is working on some type of project that aims to back their ruble with gold and potentially other commodities. So, yeah, just talk to me about that. I reckon you're not surprised, right?
Actually, I'm not surprised at all. On August 15th of 1971, Richard Nixon announced wage and price controls. Okay. Everybody's forgotten that. And as a minor aside, towards the end of the speech, he said, oh, by the way, we're going to take the US off the gold standard. Okay. It's a temporary measure and we don't need gold. Now, Russia and China have been accumulating gold for years, and this is not an accident. You get some very smart people in both Russia and China, and they anticipated the United States was going to put sanctions on them for one reason or another. The United States is terrified of competition. The West has a debt-based financial system. Since 1971, all its money has been put into the system by loans. All money is loaned into existence. But when you have interest rates in a debt-based system, there is always more money owed than actually exists. If you go back to Babylonian times, when that happened in Babylonia, every 50 years or so, they would have a reset of the currency. They called it a jubilee. And they talk about this in the Bible, and it makes a lot of sense. Rather than have the farmers in what is now Iraq, starve because they couldn't afford to pay their debts, they just wiped the debts out, started all over again. The West needs to do that. And instead, it's doing exactly the opposite. The Fed is totally trapped. If they go back to QE to save the stock market, inflation goes through the roof. Now, energy prices are going to continue to go up, and food prices are going to continue to go up. And we are going to have a food crisis today that it's never occurred in my lifetime. I'm not talking about Ethiopia and Sudan. I'm talking about France, Germany, the United States, Canada. People are going to go into grocery stores and there's going to be a lot of empty shelves. It's not just a question of can people afford it. It's a question of there's a lot of food that's not going to be grown this year because the cost of fertilizer and the inputs, cost of diesel are so expensive. So we were in bad shape prior to the Ukraine war. And now we're in catastrophic shape, and we've got the most dismal leadership in world history. When the United States and the EU put sanctions on Russia, they fell into Putin's trap. If you go back to 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russians had been through some rough times, but they survived. The EU and the United States have never been through rough times like that. And it's going to be exceptionally dangerous and difficult for them to survive. So let's go to the new, I'm not going to call it the new world order. I'm going to call it the new financial system. Putin really outsmarted the West. When they announced the sanctions, the ruble dropped to 160 to 1. And Putin came out and said, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. If you want to buy oil or natural gas or grain for us, you're going to have to pay for it in rubles. Okay. You stole $300 billion from us, so we don't trust you and you don't obey the law anymore. So you got to pay in rubles. Of course, you don't have to buy grain from us. You can always starve. And he said, and we're going to take the money that we get for oil and wheat, and we're going to buy gold. Mm. What he effectively did by doing that is created a resource-based financial system. We're in an interesting time, but the beauty is China, India, and Russia are joining together in what is essentially a resource-based financial system. And the implications of that are world-class. It's going to be the biggest economic change in history, and it's going to shift the center of gravity of the financial system 5,000 miles to the east, and it's going to give them an enormous amount of power. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in the United States and Europe. The inflation is so high now, there are riots and protests literally all over the world. And the food inflation, the energy inflation has just started. So we're in for some interesting but bad times.
You say, what do they do now? What does the US do now? And I think that's an interesting question that might have us talking about the implications in this whole new system that you're talking about. Because it makes me think about the value, not the price, the actual intrinsic value of gold, which seems to me to have risen now that it might have broader utility. But then on the other hand, that would also mean that the dollar no longer has the value that it had before the ruble was pegged to the dollar. You can joke about the dollar being worthless or not having value as a fiat currency, but it has value to people who make transactions in it, right? So it had some value. Because the way that I understand it, by the way, is that Russia wants to become independent from the dollar, but dependent on commodities, which they have plenty of. So that system would make a lot of sense for them. But so exactly. Does that mean that the intrinsic value of gold, the value, is going up and the intrinsic value of the dollar is going down? Is that a fair statement?
No, because intrinsic value is fixed. The intrinsic value of gold never changes. Okay, an ounce of gold, it's an ounce of gold, it's an ounce of gold. It's true now, it's true 100 years ago, it's true 1,000 years ago. The intrinsic value of paper money is exactly the same thing. A dollar bill is a dollar bill, it's a dollar bill. What happens is the exchange rate and the value, not the intrinsic value, but the perceived value at any given time. Since 1971, the value of the dollar has gone down by 98%. So, does it have any intrinsic value? Well, yeah, you could always take a big stack of it and start a fire with it. You've alluded to something that I find interesting. Gold doesn't really have any intrinsic value, okay? The only value of gold is that it does a great job of serving as money. Now, I've said for years, I am not a gold bug, and I am not a gold bug, but we were going to go to a gold standard, not because anybody wanted to, but because we have to. And Putin is surrounded by some brilliant people, and they knew, one, they were being attacked by the United States and NATO for the last 30 years. And the United States and NATO have made it crystal clear that they want to destroy Russia and China. And he said, okay, what can we do? And he said, we'll just set up our own reserve currency. And it's going to be based around commodities, and it's going to be based around oil, gold, and probably wheat. It's a really interesting situation because I've always believed we'd go back to a straight gold standard, and Putin's come up with something that's a resource-based standard. It's very interesting. But right now, Putin controls the price of gold. He can make it go up or he can make it go down. Here's the key to understanding the dollar. Every form of money, whether it's salt, big round rocks, beads, or pieces of paper, or gold, only has value as long as both people agree it has value. Now, if people look at the D-mark, or actually, I don't know whether they call it, I don't remember what German currency was, the mark in 1922. But people looked at the mark and said, shit, this thing isn't worth anything. Hyperinflation is not a lot of inflation. Hyperinflation is when people realize their money's no good and they need to get rid of it as fast as they can. And when you've got 70% inflation PPI basis in Norway and 30% in Germany, you are on the edge of hyperinflation. When the Ukrainian war concludes, and I believe that it will conclude very shortly, people are going to reevaluate the sanctions. They're going to reevaluate the damage that's been done to the EU and the US. And they're going to say, their currency is no good. What Putin and the Chinese have done is simply brilliant. We're going to go back to an economy that is based on producing things of value, selling them at a fair price, and not giving 100% of the profit to the 1%. We have the greatest dichotomy in history between the 1% on one hand and the 99% on the other hand. And people are going to be very angry.
All in all, to sort of conclude, this means that we just handed control of the price of commodities to Russia, at least for the short term. So sort of that could concentrate the wealth for a period of time. But do you think that Russia wants to necessarily send commodities higher? Because, they produce a lot of commodities, but they're not a quickly growing country, nor are they really interested in becoming a quickly growing country, I think. So they don't necessarily need cheap commodities to build out too much stuff like the Chinese do, for example, but they sell a lot of commodities. So following that logic, would they want to send the prices of commodities really high, or how do you see that?
What it really means is the ruble is going to have extreme value. The ruble went from 160 at the end of March to 71. Okay, it more than doubled. It was the best investment you could make for the last 2 months. And that was total shock to everybody except Putin. What it means is the ruble is going to be very valuable because it's backed by real things. And then people are going to say, well, if the ruble is valuable because it's backed by real things, what's the value of the euro, or what's the value of the dollar? And they're going to include hot air. Okay. Putin and the Chinese have changed the financial game. The rest of the world can adopt to it and figure out how can we use this to our advantage. Maybe India would like to buy oil cheaper from Russia than from the US. So it's an opportunity. If you look at it, it's an opportunity. And what I have not seen is any leadership for the EU. The EU has acted like a lapdog for the United States. Okay. The United States says bark, the EU barks. The United States says roll over, the EU rolls over. Why do they do that? That's stupid.